Welcome, Gary. Thank you so much for coming and agreeing to be interviewed.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, this is sort of a testament to your teaching legacy. So, you've been part of the Smith fabric for such a long time. And now, as you prepare to head on to your next adventure, we wanted to sort of pick your brain a little bit about everything that you've learned as a teacher at Smith, the contributions that you've made, and what you would share with some new faculty. So, first question, how long have we had the pleasure of had you teaching at Smith?
What's interesting is when I was in graduate school teaching many years ago, it wasn't Smith. It was just actually, I think it was called the College of Business. I did all my degrees at Maryland. And back in those days, I started the master's program. Then I went into the doctoral program. Doctoral program in business was just starting. In those days, doctoral students taught full time. So I was a full-time instructor, and I wasn't that much older than the students. So, I've run into a lot of my former students now who are retired. Some of my former students are adjunct faculty, teaching at
Wow.
Maryland. Yeah. So then I finished the degree. I was away for 32 years. For 2 years, I was writing questions for the CPA exam, and then 30 years at American University in DC. And then this is my 16th year back. Now it's the Smith School. So the exact answer to your question, how many years at Smith? 16. How many years at Maryland? A lot more than that.
But that's amazing that some of your students are now teachers at Smith. Like, what an amazing way to impact the culture here.
Yeah, every once in a while, a doctoral student when they were teaching the course in the summer or something, they'd sit in my class and I'd work with them. You have any material I have, it doesn't matter. And then they would teach it. Or somebody who several years ago, she told me she had gotten a full-time position somewhere and she was going to be teaching managerial accounting and had never taught it. So she sat in my class and I worked with her. And then she wrote me a very nice letter saying she's taught it and she got an award or something like that. So I thought that was great. So I'm not saying that what I do is perfect, but whatever it is, she modeled and liked it. So
Absolutely. And I think that's something I've always admired about you, though, Gary, your generosity with your teaching expertise, right? You don't sort of keep it so that you have the secret sauce. You're always willing to share it. And so, with that in mind,
that's nice of you to say.
yeah, so with that in mind, what would you tell a new faculty starting out right now?
I think the first point, like any speech, be prepared. And if someone asks you a question you don't know, don't be afraid to say, I don't know, I'll check on it, because that's going to happen. Many years ago, I remember, I'll tell a story. It was the first semester I was teaching, and I was explaining something in accounting one, and I was getting myself all confused. So I got home, went through it, and straightened it out. I went to class, the next class, and I said, cross out all your notes from the last class. I said, I'm going to redo it. Then I said, my explanation was based on an invalid assumption. And then I said, I assumed I knew what I was talking about. And that broke the ice beautifully. Everybody laughed. Sometimes when I make a mistake, and we all do, and if someone says I never make a mistake, probably OTL people would say, turn around and run away. That's what I like to sometimes say is, I'll make a mistake and correct it, and the class will laugh. And I say, hey, when I make a mistake, we all laugh. And then I say, when you guys make a mistake, so you repeat the course. And again, it's said to be funny, not to be serious. And they know that. Nobody's taking that seriously. You make a joke out of it. My favorite story, I'm going to talk about the what we always talk about with selling yourself. I learned this from the people at OTL, and I think it's so important. I only learned it in the last couple years, though. Sell yourself, explain why you're doing things. Some things you'll take for granted, like, oh, they understand why I'm doing it. No, they don't. Or at least a lot of people don't. For example, if I'm going through something technical in accounting, I sometimes like to read right from the book. I'll read a paragraph or a sentence, and I like to stop and say, what's that mean? Or sometimes I'll say, who would like to translate this into English or something like that? In other words, read it and discuss it. So now what I do is I'll read something and I say, I like reading something and then discussing it. So, people can understand why you're doing it. And I find it's great to do in a college class, but I do a lot of I teach a lot of continuing education for CPAs, and I say the same thing with them. So I think that's great advice. Understand what you're doing and why you're doing it. When you get evaluations, look at the evaluations and see if there's some constructive criticism that can, think about it. Explain, okay, I'm doing it because, or hey, maybe there's a better way I can do it. And you don't be afraid to learn from that. The routine I like to follow, and it doesn't mean this is the best way to do it. It's your comfort level is important. What I like to do is it's counting class. Go over a problem, whatever the chapter is, there's an example problem in there. And I like to go over it. Again, not just reading it and saying, do this, but explaining each step along the way and asking questions about it. And I know you guys at OTL have talked about this. It's like we do in accounting, what are called journal entries. Look at transaction, you make an entry, which would go in the company's books. And what I love to do is say, okay, look at entry 7 and look at entry 4, compare them. What do they have in common? What's similar? What's different? Why is it different? I try to build in as much as possible real world. I mean, I tell students, you're an accountant, you're a consultant, and talk about not only explaining something to a client, but understanding how clients will react. People skills, a lot of it is, which are absolutely vital, knowing how to talk to people. But, sometimes we'll go over a problem. I was doing that in advanced accounting this morning, going over a problem and saying, okay, look at the results that we're coming up with. It's a partnership and they're splitting up and this one gets this much money and this one gets that much money. I said, okay, you're the one not getting much money, or you're the consultant. I'm the one not getting much money. And I start saying to you, this is ridiculous. I don't like what you're doing. You're cheating me. What are you going to do? And, they know to take it seriously. Every once in a while, somebody will say something like, too bad. And I said, that's probably a good answer, but don't say that. It's not professional, and get them to explain to a client again that what I want them to do is be explaining what's going on here. So in other words, it's not just me explaining it to you, but you explaining it to a client. And I think students like situations like that because it builds in real world. In my accounting 2 class, I love to show them how accounting ties in with other fields. Like there'll be an issue and we'll start discussing, and I say, okay, this is a marketing issue. I'm not holding myself out as a marketing expert. We're using accounting data to address a marketing issue. And I just want to get them to see that interrelationship. Think back, most people think back to when you were a student and you had a course. Every course was a silo. You don't understand how they're all interrelated. And even within a course, chapter 1, good, forget it. Chapter 2, good, forget it. Chapter 3, no, they are all interrelated.
I'm so glad that you shared that, Gary. And one thing I think all of your advice centers on is the idea that there's a partnership between you and the students.
I think that's a great way to put it. That's exactly right. And that's the traditional concept has always been we're at odds with each other. And it's we're here for the same reason. And I once worded it that way. And again, just to be a little silly and funny, I said, we're here for the same reason, to get you out of here. And then I said, one way or another. And they know at that point I'm being serious, but throwing in something silly. And sometimes I like to say something silly just to get their attention and let them remember it better.
And you have to be yourself. You mentioned at the beginning sort of being able to say, I don't know, and being able to reflect on a mistake and go back in and say, I made a mistake. And I think that's about remembering that we as teachers are human too, and allowing the students to see that, right? Not having to uphold the expert, that
you know everything all the time. And, and I've attended some training sessions through the American Institute of CPAs because I've taught continuing education through them. And some of the things they've said, a lot of stuff that you've said, and also how to deal with someone who's a negative person in class. And that's something we can all face. And, starting to scream at the person accomplishes absolutely nothing, obviously. And it's stressful. But one of the first thing they said is just say to somebody, oh, would you like to teach the class? Come on up. Of course, if they say, yeah, I'll be up there in a minute, that's a problem. And I remember once we were talking about someone who never volunteers. And personally, I'm not comfortable just calling on people. We've talked about that a little bit too. That's a comfort level. And they said, you call on somebody and, okay, Darren, what's 1 + 1? And Darren says 2. And I said, fantastic, that's great. And you give the person encouragement. And then the person who was teaching it, facilitator, was saying that. So I raised my hand and I said, but what if it's the wrong answer? So I said, what are you supposed to say? You were better off when you were quiet, So everybody laughed, of course. And he said, what you have to do is ask something that's more of an opinion, not an absolute answer, and then kind of build on it in some way. And I thought that was a nice way to put it. Because I know when I've attended continuing education seminars for CPAs, when I was going as an attendee, not the teacher, and they'll bounce around the room and call on people, and it makes me very nervous. And I remember one class, and this was like 150 people. And what the person who was teaching it was doing, you had a book with questions, and he was going up the aisle and down the aisle, So you count ahead and see which question is yours. And with that many people, I figured I better give myself 2 on each side just in case. And the answers are in the book. So you look up the answer so you can sound brilliant when he gets to you. But I thought that I didn't like doing that.
Yeah, also because you stop listening, because you start counting.
That's exactly right. You're more focused on which one am I going to get and how am I going to answer.
Yes, versus, like you said, you do teach sometimes with real world scenarios and problems. And I think that really sets the student up to think, how would I really do this in this moment? There's no correct answer. It's what would your approach be? And then you can give them feedback to say that would be a more or less professional approach, or that there's a specific tool that they could use. And it's a chance for you to scaffold their learning, even though they were the ones who answered the question.
And that's, and that's a good way to put it. That's exactly right. Is building on it. Talking about responding to negative comments. Many years ago, I was teaching an in-person CPA review class. It was tax. And I had taught it for years. And it was a big group. It was over 100 people. And I started explaining something, and somebody in the back, one of the participants yells, "You're wrong." And I said, okay, I can make a mistake. A few minutes later, the same thing. And I thought, this has to stop. And you could see when he said that, you could see people looking at him like, what's with you? So I thought, okay, I got to talk to him. He left right after class. So I memorized his face. And the next class I had, which was like 2 weeks later, I was there setting up and I saw him walk in. I went like this and he came down. I said, I would appreciate it if I make a mistake that there's a polite way to correct somebody, a tactful way to do it. I'd appreciate if you would do that. And he went, well, they're studying for the CPA exam. I said, I've taught this stuff long enough that if I don't know it by heart, it's probably not on the CPA exam. And then one person came up with me and said, they think he was trying to impress the girl sitting next to him. And I said, I'm sure she probably ran to the other side of the room. That and the rest of the time he was fine. The last day of class, he did that again. And I went, okay, we're starting over. And everybody just started laughing. So
it's true. I was actually thinking, when I think about issues like that, because there's always, a student who just, the chemistry is wrong, or don't want to be in that class and it's really not about you. They just don't want to be there. And I think what really is a testament to your teaching is when the other students say it, when the other students say, oh, it's awful that he did that, or we think you're great. I'm sorry that happened in your class. That's a sign of everything that you're doing right.
That's that's a nice way to put it. When I was at Maryland the first time, we didn't have people sitting in on your class. We didn't do any class observations the way we do now. And I was working in New York at the American Institute of CPAs, and I was teaching a night class at Bernard Baruch in City University. And so one night they called me and they said, somebody's going to come in to do an evaluation. He came in, he sat there, took notes for 10 minutes and left. I didn't say anything to the class, but when he left, I said to the class, another time I'll tell you why he was here. Well, it didn't dawn on me. They obviously knew. They've seen that over and over. So one of the students said, we know why he was there. And one student said, you should have told us. We would have made you look great. Which I thought was so nice.
Absolutely. I think it goes back to the idea that you treat the students as if you're a community once they're in your classroom.
And that's a good way. That's a good way to put it. We're all here together.
I have one last question for you, because I promised we were going to keep it short. So my last question is, what would you say to a student that has been your student 20 years ago, or who was your student this semester, last semester, what would you say to them?
When I see former students at like a CPA dinner, I like to say, is there anything, given what you know now, anything you would do differently when you were in college? And watching students grow up, I love that. And, anyone that's going to see this who's starting to teach will understand what I mean as you go through semesters, as you go through a given semester. This was when I was back at my second round at Maryland. So it was like 15, 14 years ago, whatever. And accounting one, and I would give quizzes and drop the lowest two quizzes or whatever. One kid, not that he didn't do well, but he didn't live up to his own personal standards. And he came to talk to me. And we talked a little bit. And I usually like to talk about focusing the studying. One of the things he said, my friends told me I didn't have to go to class. And I said, what do you think? He said, I haven't been coming to class, but I think I probably should. I said, I think you should also. Then he started coming to class. He ended up with an A in the course. And I love telling that story. I saw him grow up in front of my face. Well, the PS to the story, several years ago, my wife and I were in Bethesda on a Saturday evening in the summer, and we're taking a little walk, and he happened to be there with his wife and another couple. They were sitting outside having dinner. When he saw me walk by, he yelled for me, and came over. And so, we introduced and all that, and I met his wife and his friends. And I said, I'm going to tell you a story. And I told him that story. And I said, I saw you grow up in front of my face. His wife said, I'm not so sure about that.
That's lovely. I've been teaching for 8 years, and so I'm just at that point where I have some students who are out in the world, who have been successful. Some have finished medical school. One of my very first batches of students has finished medical school now.
That's
and
great.
I'm beginning that journey. It's so exciting when you still hear from them and they remembered you, Gary.
Yeah.
You had an impact on them.
That is always exciting, when someone does remember you. I'll tell you a funny story too. Recently, a student, again, that I had a couple years ago in accounting too, and he reached out to me and we started keeping in touch. And he's graduated a couple years ago. He was not an accounting major, but we kept in touch and we still keep in touch. And I got him involved with OTL, with your Innova program. And he was so good. You guys, your team liked him so much that he ended up with an internship. So he and I, met for dinner one night and we were talking about that. He said, I really have you to thank for that. I said, I opened the door for you, but if you weren't good, they wouldn't have, they liked you. It wasn't because of me. I said, they liked you. So then the PS to the story, we're having dinner one night and it's out of the blue. He said, oh, I have a girlfriend now. I said, that's great. How'd you meet? He said, she was in the Innova class. So then he said, I have you to thank for that also. So I thought that was really funny.
I think that's wonderful to hear. I think I really, I appreciate you doing this with us.
Well, thank you.
We do a new faculty orientation every August, and we'll be featuring you this year.
Oh, well, that's exciting. Do I get royalties?
If only. If we make it big, we'll send a check your way, I promise.
Well, that's nice of you to say. Thank you, dear. And this was a lot of fun. And certainly wish you all the very best. It's retiring because it's time in terms of my life, and it's a bittersweet type of thing. It's exciting and it's scary. That's what I said to my students. I said, you guys are seniors and thinking next year, you'll be working somewhere, and it's frightening. Something new like that is always frightening for me too. I said, we're graduating together, so.
Well, I know that you're going to be sorely missed, but I know that Smith has been nothing but improved for your teaching.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you to say that.